And he continues by saying, from now on, the place where we seek the power to love is not the law of commandments, but the gospel of Christ. And that sounds, end quote, by the way, and that sounds almost a little like a dig, like he's, what do we say? Like he's putting the Torah down a little bit, like he's saying that the law of God has lost its effectiveness, right? We don't seek the power to love in the law of commandments, but the law of Christ. I understand the gist of what he's trying to say. So those of you who are Torah positive, Torah, obedient types of people, don't get the wrong idea where he says we don't seek the power of love in the commandments. There is love in the commandments. Indeed, Israel was commanded to love the Lord your God and to love your neighbor as yourself, right? The great two that Yeshua reiterated. Those are found squarely in the Torah, right? Deuteronomy chapter 6 for loving the Lord your God, and Leviticus for love your neighbor as yourself. So it's not that the Torah doesn't contain commandments to love. It's that the Torah outside of the power of the Holy Spirit doesn't have it in itself the power to motivate you to love the proper way. So going back to our studies, looking at what the Torah does for us outside of Messiah, it commands us to do the right thing, but it doesn't have the power to change the heart and to change the mind and the volition of a person. That's the role of the Holy Spirit in us. The Torah is that standard that the Holy Spirit uses. The Torah is the tool used by God to help bring about that change. The Torah in and of itself cannot bring that change about. Mentally and intellectually, it can guide you, and there are people who are disciplined enough outside of the Holy Spirit to actually follow in the path of righteousness, and so of their own, you can do the right thing for a measured amount of time. But ultimately, God designed the Torah to simply bring you into a knowledge of Messiah, and then to be that role, that tool of the Holy Spirit to continue to lead you in paths of righteousness and sanctification. It's a sanctification tool used by the Holy Spirit. It was never ever designed to be a salvation tool, right? Don't ever get that mistake. Don't ever make that mistake. Don't get that part about the Torah wrong. It has never been, and is never, as not, it neither was nor is, nor ever will be, a salvation tool, a salvific tool. It's not that type of document. So, Pastor Piper, not Pastor Piper, but myself, I say, indeed, the whole thrust of that particular sermon, the one that I'm referencing from Pastor Piper, is to show in his own words that quote, and here's another quote from Pastor Piper, the path to love is not works of law. And I really like that. Let me interject. If you correctly understand works of law as not mere what we might call human effort, we could say legalism, but Judaism wasn't wielding the Torah in the same wooden fashion that the church likes to imagine that she was. Nevertheless, it still amounted to self-effort, or what Paul termed as the flesh. The phrase works of law is more of kind of a technical term that I don't want to get into right now, but just suffice to say, the path to love, genuine, heartfelt, Messiah, spirit-led love, that can only take place if you have surrendered your will to Yeshua himself. If you'd allowed God to take up residency within you via his Spirit, then the path to loving not only God, but loving your neighbor as yourself, then you can fulfill the righteous requirement that the Torah is putting before you. Like Paul says in Romans chapter 8, the first, say, 5 to 10 verses there in that chapter. This is how we're able to fulfill the righteous requirement of the Torah. It's by allowing Yeshua to take his place in our heart and his Spirit to fill us, so that we can not only love God properly, but love one another properly. And that's what Pastor Piper is getting at when he says the path to love is not works of the law. He's not trying to slam Torah obedience. He's not trying to slam loyalty to Torah or covenant loyalty, or what the Jews of Yeshua's day would call, or Paul's day would call, covenantal nomism or works of the law or any of that stuff. It had its limitations. It had its pitfalls. But in the end, the Jews are simply seeking to be loyal to God, and they're doing their best to try to do what God's asking them to do. To that regard, they've got the right mindset, right? They're in the proper mindset. They go wrong when they think that Torah is really the end all, be all, do all, which kind of props up Jewish lifestyle, Jewish identity, Jewish membership, and Jewish responsibility to keep the Torah, minus any Gentile participation and things like that.